call this meeting of the city's Planning and Zoning Commission to order. The Planning and Zoning Commission is an independent advisory body of the City of Ames City Council. The Planning and Zoning Commission members are volunteers of the community and not part of the city administration. The Planning and Zoning Commission is supported by staff from the city's planning division. The commission is responsible for recommendations on matters involving subdivisions, annexations, master plans, major site development plans, amendments to the zoning ordinance, and comprehensive plan amendments. We make our recommendations based on city codes, facts presented, and input from the public. As an advisory commission, we welcome all comments regarding the proposed item. Please direct your input to the commission. If the proceedings become lengthy, we may ask that comments be focused on new information not previously presented. You may speak only once on an agenda item. If you wish to speak, please fill out a speaker information card and present it to the recording secretary. We ask that you come to the microphone to speak so that all comments may be recorded. The order of the proceeding for each item on the agenda will be as follows. City staff will present the staff report regarding the agenda item. Commission members will have an opportunity to ask questions of city staff. The applicant will be invited to make a statement regarding the request. Commission members will have an opportunity to ask questions of the applicant. Members of the audience will be invited to come forward to offer comments and questions. Once public comment is closed, city staff and the applicant will have an opportunity for concluding remarks. The commission will discuss the application based on all presentations and any comments given and come to a recommendation for city council. The discussion may include further questions of city staff and the applicant for clarification. With that, we will move on to the first item on the agenda, which is the introduction of commission members. Start from the right.
Mike Clayton.
Mike Sullivan.
John Emery.
Mike LaPetra.
Matthew Voss.
All right. And then we'll move on to the next item, which is approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Against, say nay. Motion passes. The agenda is approved. The next item is approval of the minutes from the April 5th, 2023 meeting. I ask for a motion on that.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion passes. The minutes have been approved. Now we're ready for the public forum. So we'll open the public forum. Anybody want to speak? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public forum and move to the next item, which is public hearing on the rezoning master plan amendment for 798 North 500th Avenue, which is North Sunset Ridge.
Good evening. Good evening. This item is rezoning for a master plan amendment. It is one that came before you in February, but it's a request for another amendment. The location is 798 North 500th Avenue, otherwise known as North Sunset Ridge. So the document up on the screen shows the zoning and the location. It's immediately north of the Sunset Ridge development. It is zoned FSRL. The zoning is not proposed to be changed. The only changes that they are really proposing is to add flexibility to the type of housing that can be developed and the maximum number of units. Right now, the current master plan only allows detached single-family units, and they are wanting to add they're wanting to change the area that's in kind of this bluish color in here to show the potential of adding attached single-family units. So it would not impact the properties to the south. Those properties would be backed with regular single-family detached units. But this will give the developer flexibility to add attached single-family units in this area. It impacts about 2.5 acres of the total site. The total site is 28.58 acres. And the maximum unit count in the previous master plan was 75, and this would bump it up to 80 as a maximum number of units. We evaluated it from the standpoint of the Ames Plan 2040, and it met the criteria shown for RN3. And it meets the density requirements of the Ames Plan 2040. And open space and stormwater really is not being changed at all. So it's consistent with the adopted Ames Plan 2040. As described in the addendum, it's consistent with what's been anticipated for this area. The only thing that's changing are the housing types and total number of units that are being adjusted. So it would restrict the maximum to no more than 80 single-family attached and detached units. And Planning and Housing supports alternative 1, which states the Planning and Zoning Commission can recommend that the City Council approve the amended master plan for 28.58 acres at 798 North 500th Avenue to allow for a portion of the site to be developed with either attached or detached single-family housing and for a maximum development of 80 homes. I'm happy to answer any questions.
There's still planning to be a city park north of there?
Yes.
Okay.
But that doesn't really have anything to do with this development.
Okay.
I noticed on the comparing attachment D to E on the west side there's change to the in D it says open space and a large portion of that, and on E it says future development. Is that, I guess, explain what's going on there a little bit, I guess?
Well, what that's going on is I attached the wrong existing master plan.
Oh,
That's
okay.
the one, that actually is the one that was the initial master plan, but not the one that was amended in February. I apologize. The
Should've
one in
remembered that.
February did show this is future development, and a possible connection to the north is, a connection to the north is anticipated possibly in this location. So the only thing that's changed in this plan is, as I said, this part that's in this aqua blue color in here. But I apologize. That's a good question that you had.
No worries. Thanks. All right. Any other questions for staff? All right. I guess oh, go ahead.
So that means that there'll be 5 townhouses?
Within the master plan, there's always a range. Here's the table. I'll zoom in on that. So there's a range of what can be built. And so when you add up the total of the maximum range, you end up with 5 more. But there's flexibility. The master plan's intended to have flexibility in how it's implemented, both with the acreage, the density, and the number of units.
Yeah, and typically we only look at the maximums and the minimums. So like that says 14 to 18, which is a real narrow range. Maybe on the final one, we'll make that clear that 14 is probably not a minimum, because there is, we haven't laid out the lots yet. We haven't gone through preliminary plat. That's a real narrow range. Usually we have a pretty wide range. So we'll probably look at that to make sure those ranges aren't so narrow, so it doesn't appear as if the minimum is the one that's restricting a project. It's the maximums that you're typically looking at restricting the projects.
Yeah,
Because we got really, now that I look at that, after you say that, we have 45 to 49, 10 to 13, 14 to 18. That's really precise for not having seen a plat. So
But
usually
it's
we're,
the blue area that we're really
Yeah.
discussing and.
Yeah.
And it's gonna back up to open spaces and could have a possibility of what you call it, the attached or townhouses.
Correct.
right. So we don't use that term in the
Right,
zoning
right,
ordinance
I
right now,
understand
but yeah, it means it could be anywhere between 2 to 5 attached units in a row under FSRL zoning. So yeah, it's only the blue area that's affected.
Any further questions of staff? Okay. At this time, we'd invite the applicant to come up and make a statement regarding this request.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Justin Dodge, Hunsaker Companies, 105 South 16th Street. Appreciate you guys taking a look at this again. I think this is the third time we've had this property up for a master plan, but as we looked at our stock of lots, we had 0 townhome lots left in the entire city. And so we felt it was important to hit the pause button and to figure out where we could add that housing type into the market. And so that's what we're doing. Appreciate Kelly and Eloise getting this on your guys' agenda so quickly. And we will have a preliminary plat submitted as soon as we can to keep this going, as we are in the middle of working on the sanitary sewer right now with the city. So at that, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Why do you want to change this?
To add on some townhome lots, because we have 0 in the entire market. We know that there are going to be people that want to live in a townhome, and we can hit a price point that we can't hit on a detached single-family home. And so in looking back at all of our conversations with Sunset Ridge and the adjacent property owners to the south, we had told them all along that we would only have single-family detached homes on the back sides of their property. And so that's why we've only got townhomes on the north side of the street, was to keep in line with what we promised the neighbors.
That was going to be the next question.
Yeah. And there were lots of questions earlier on, inside our office as well as inside City Hall of, well, we like to have some balance, but then all of a sudden that would really put us against what we told all the neighbors, and we didn't want to be in that spot.
And you're going to meld it into the neighborhood.
Yeah. Yep.
And so there won't be an issue with property north of it because there's not going to be.
There will be an outlot to the north of it. And so we've got some stormwater.
Go back to the map. The city park actually doesn't extend all the way across the northbound. The planned city park does not extend all the way across their entire north property line. But as Justin's saying, they're planning for open space. They're not up against any property line here. So there could be homes north of that green space.
Okay.
The park is really to the east.
Where the other green area is.
Yeah. So think of Wilder, which really bisects the middle of the site.
Yep.
That's roughly the southwest-ish corner of the land the city is looking to acquire.
You can actually see some dashed lines
There might-
to the north and west of the connection point.
Yeah.
And that's the boundary of what the city is in negotiations to purchase for the city park.
And we don't require that there's any special setback for an attached home versus a detached from like a backyard to backyard perspective. So we have no issues, especially with the green space they're showing as being compatible in the future.
All I was concerned about was the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So. Okay.
Any other questions?
No.
Very good. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right. Are there any members of the audience that would like to make any comments or questions? Hearing none, we can close the public comment. And open it up for discussion here. Or I guess we do conclude. What comes next? Concluding remarks from city staff? Are there any
If we have any
additional?
questions, yeah.
Yeah,
Question the city staff and then
yep, okay,
good discussion between us.
okay. Any further questions for city staff? Well, do we have any discussion for ourselves, or anyone have a motion?
Motion for alternative one. Planning and Zoning Commission can recommend that the city council approve the amended master plan for 28.58 acres at 798 North 100th Avenue to allow for a portion of the site to be developed with either attached or detached single-family housing and for a maximum development of 80 homes.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. All right. That's good then. All right, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the zoning text amendment on setback encroachments for accessory structures.
Can you bring it up? Screen the pictures.
You have them out.
What's that? I do. You're right. I have no screen.
I mean, I can put pictures here if
I
you
need
want.
the computer on the screen though. All right. Good evening, Commission. So tonight we're talking about a text amendment. It's a somewhat small issue that we're talking about accessory features really on a property. The genesis of this really came through a couple of code enforcement cases that were appealed to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. And the way I'm sorry, we just don't have the webpage up. I don't have a keyboard, so can you get me to the? I wasn't prepared for this. So can you give me the graphic, the slideshow? So as we went through the appeal process, it became clear that the current language we have, which was meant to be flexible, was probably too flexible, and it caused a lot of consternation in how things would be interpreted, probably beyond the intent of the city when we wrote this. So we took this to City Council in the winter, and the primary issue is what this feature is that we call a landscape accent. In the older codes, it talked about essentially things that were 4 feet or less in size or on the ground level as features or structures in a setback. And then it had an allowance for an arbor of 10 square feet. So that's a pretty small 3x3 kind of arched structure. Arbors can be imagined to be a lot of different things, but that was what it was. So we tried to open that up a little bit, understanding a lot of people have things that are not traditional arbors, but are very similar. And we created the language we have now. And the key controlling element of the current language was that essentially you weren't creating a fence. Like it wasn't a workaround to avoid our fence regulations. So for fences, they're in a different section. If you're in the front yard, you have a 4-foot height limit. If you're in the side or the rear, it's a 6-foot height limit within those areas. So the key was that you were not enclosing enough area or making a structure that would have that ability to be a barrier or create a fence. And that was what got appealed to the ZBA when we had 2 different cases that were unrelated about attaching things to fences or whether an enclosure was a fence. So that absent a fence permit or absent any permitting process, that just meant code enforcement happened after you built something, which is not a great way to do code enforcement, is to not get permission, but then told you're wrong in the end. So we really do want to edit this section, and going through this with City Council,
You want that?
we talked about a couple of different options, and I think the goal was to still provide quite a bit of flexibility to homeowners. And we use this presentation to kind of talk about different things you can see out in the community right now that may be allowed or are features that we may want to allow. So here's an example of what I would call an arbor. It's really it's over top of a gate, but it would meet that definition of an arbor. This is totally allowed right now. It's less than 15 square feet in size. that fence conforms to all the front yard fence requirements and the arbor extends above the fence line, that's all fine now. So these are the kinds of things like, well, we're not trying to limit things that we had already allowed. So we went through a couple of these issues. This is where it starts to get into some of the other definitions where we have planter boxes that had 4-foot height limits. Again, what is a fence? Well, now you have these wire elements that are more than 4 feet high. Are they enclosing a space? Are they higher than the planter box allowances? They probably are. But at the same time, were 2 of these small features objectionable? That's what we were asking City Council. So this does not meet current code. If we were to do code enforcement, they'd have to cut those down to 4 feet in height. They're probably closer to 5, maybe 6 on that back one. But council thought, these are 2 planter boxes. They're not really disturbing the front yard or enclosing space. So how can we allow for these types of things to exist? This is the structure that actually was appealed to the ZBA. So this was, I don't remember the dimensions. I don't know if we have it up here, but effectively it was over 6 feet tall. It was around, a 20 by 15, or maybe it was a 30 by 15 enclosure. This was determined that it was a fence because of the size, length, and its purpose. So under our rules, that's going to have to get cut down to 4 feet. It's too tall, it's too big to meet these allowances. So here was a good picture of a lot of different things that you are allowed to do in your yard. And we walk through how all of them are permissible for different reasons. And we were, again, not trying to restrict the planter boxes, a growing table. A rain barrel is not a structure, it's a barrel. It's just different. And then those hooped wire things aren't considered structures because they're not permanently affixed to the ground, because they're movable and they're not really structures. So we walked through this, that this is probably the most complete collection of things that still meet code right now, and would still be permissible after we do make a text amendment. Here was this is not in the city, but here's an example of something that doesn't meet current code because it's too big. So if we have just that 15 square foot arbor allowance, this structure is too big. The outside footprint of it and its height are just too great to be in that setback. So this is something that would need to meet setbacks, and it wouldn't meet the current code because it's too big. Here was another example, and this is maybe the genesis of what we were trying to maybe allow with our proposal. So here are our 3 vertical panels, right? Some people might call them a trellis. You could call it a fence. They're not connected. So are they a fence? Like, this is where the questions start to come in of what are we interpreting as a fence? So in the proposed language, these would be fine because there are 3 or less of them in the setback, even though they exceed the 4-foot height limit, because this is a corner lot that's along the street. So you can see now, this is a good example. These types of trellis panels or other kind of fence panels that are not a true connected fence, you're going to be allowed to have 3 of those in a setback on your side yard, in your rear yard, in your front yard, depending on how you do that. But you only get 3 in those yards. So some people use these kinds of features to maybe shield off the side of a patio. You might see where someone has a lower first level window and they want some privacy with that window. So they might put up just a 6-foot panel, or a 6-foot wide panel to provide some privacy, but it wasn't really a fence. So we really wanted to let some of these types of things be allowed to exist, again, because they're not fully encroaching in the yard. They're not fully taking up the space. It seemed to be a fair balance of allowing for some people to provide privacy and other features in their land, on their lot. Then here's another example of something that wasn't really permitted, because this was, we would have had to call this a fence. It's over the height limit of a fence. It's in the setback. It's really a combination of a fence, an attached arbor, and there's some other kind of elevated structure that's all attached there. So all of those things together would really need to meet setbacks. So that would have to come off of that property line, meet a side yard setback, meet a rear yard setback. It wasn't going to be permitted within the current exceptions that we have, or it'd have to be reduced in height down to that 6 feet on that side property line. So again, a lot of different things are out there. This was just a sampling of those things to help people get an idea of what type of features people are putting out there on their property and what are we trying to actually manage as the city. through this. Here's another example of a fence that was less than 6 feet in height, but you have a component of it now that exceeds 6 feet. It's a decorative trellis type of thing. Again, where we're really trying to stop that aesthetic display there as a fence or not. These are just the kinds of features that we were able to identify for discussion. So our text amendment kind of treats things a little bit differently. We are going to propose to remove the language that allows for interpretation of whether something is a fence or not. We think that provides clarity to the process. And again, we don't have a fence permit process. We don't have an encroachment permit process for these kinds of exceptions. So it seems that we need to have some pretty black and white language so a person can read the code and know what it's going to mean in almost all circumstances, and it's not a question after the fact. So our proposal then is to allow for, as I mentioned, up to 3 structures that exceed those fence height limits, and they have a footprint of no more than 8 by 8. So if your structure is only 3 by 3, but it's still 8 feet tall, that's okay, but you're using up one of your allowances. And the 8 by 8 is going to be a footprint measurement. It's really a dimension that can be no greater than 8 feet in any one dimension, right? So it could be a circle, it could be a square, it could be a rectangle, it could be whatever, but nothing greater than 8 feet in length is going to be permitted for that exception. And the other component, when we were first talking to council, we really kind of focused on the front yard. You saw some examples about side or rear yards. So what we've proposed is you get 3 of these exceptions per yard. So if you were to put 3 garden structures in your front yard, because that's where you have good solar access to grow your plants, but you really wanted privacy off of your side windows as well, and you wanted to put up 2 of those side trellis panels, that would be 5 structures. We thought that since they were in different yards, it would be okay to allow the exception per yard rather than per property. So I think that's kind of a question that's out there is how many of these do we want to permit? Should it be per property? Should it be per yard? We're proposing to allow it per yard at this point. So are there any questions about the history of this or what this language would accomplish?
We're talking about in the setback, meaning the 15
So
feet on the front yards,
it's 25,
25.
and then in the sides, it's 6 or 8 in most places. And then the rear yard, it's 20 feet. There's some other allowances for accessory buildings to be less than 20 feet already. So if you were to build a shed, this does not cover that situation. Sheds are covered under another situation where you can go as little as 3 feet. But what this would allow is 0. So if you can meet this landscape accent definition, it's just like a fence. You can go right up to the property line in terms of that there's 0 setback requirement.
Okay, then I have a question. You can look at this one, Kelly.
Okay.
When I'm talking about that'll work.
All right. I can go to that one though.
Okay.
Perfect.
The parking, what I call the parking, I don't know what you guys call it anymore. Between the sidewalk and the street,
Okay. The
What's
park strip. Sure.
what's allowed in there?
Nothing. It's city right of way. It's city controlled property that you're required to maintain as the property owner. So you can't put anything in the right of way without the city's permission.
Curious, does that include plants?
It includes street trees. So trees require a permit from the city arborist and for public works. Other than that, I'm not 100% sure because I don't manage the right of way, but in general, definitely no structures are permitted in that space. And I know street trees require permits. Other than that, I'm not 100% sure how the rest of that gets managed by public works.
Okay, I'm not trying to tell on anybody or anything like that, but there's a couple places on Wilder that people have planted all kinds of stuff in that parking, and that's not allowed.
What I said is I only know trees require permits and structures are prohibited. Between those two things, I don't know what the allowances are for vegetation. Whether you're allowed turf, whether you're allowed prairie grass, can you do a flower bed? I don't know that part.
Okay, I know, okay, that one time they had a fence, like a 3-foot fence up there. in, about 3 foot.
So I don't manage that space, so I can't answer any
Oh.
more specific questions about
And you
what's
don't know
allowed
about
or
bricking it?
I don't know anything about what you're allowed to do in that space other than street trees and no structures.
Okay.
And yeah, so we're talking on the inside of the sidewalk, not on that outside to the curb.
Okay, and that is supposed to be 25 feet,
So your front, yeah, this house is set way further back than 25 feet.
right?
And we're talking about, typically it's 25 feet in before your front setback ends. Now, interesting enough, fences are restricted to 4 feet anywhere in front of your house, not just the first 25 feet. So there's a difference between a yard and a setback. And for fences, it depends on if you're in that front yard. So anywhere in front of that white house, it's a 4-foot height limit.
If that was on the
And
corner-
that, so that, would- oops, excuse me, go ahead.
If that was on a corner, would that run down the side yard fronting the other street? Or would they then be able to go to 6 feet?
There's an allowance for corner lots. If you inset the fence, then you can go up to 6 feet. You don't have to set it all the way in. So there's the true front yard is 4 feet, and then there's allowance for 4 or 6 depending on a secondary street, like even on a through lot. There's an allowance for that to be closer to the sidewalk or closer to the property line. It's the true front that's 4 feet in all circumstances.
So that is a front yard and that is non-conforming, correct?
Well, it's not non-conforming, it's an illegal structure. Non-conforming bestows a status of legitimacy
Okay.
to it. It does not have that.
Playing with words.
Not play where they're very important.
Yeah, okay.
So yes, that's a structure that was appealed to ZBA. It was found to be a fence. It exceeds fence height limits. It needs to be cut down to 4 feet.
And under the proposed change, it would still be a fence and still,
It would still not meet the 8x8 exception.
right.
So that's why, I'm not saying how he could alter. I mean, he could alter this in other ways if this was adopted to maybe meet the 8x8 exceptions, but they would have to be unattached. And it wouldn't be this. It could be similar, but it wouldn't be this. Or you just cut it to 4 feet and then it's a fence and it's compliant.
What went into the 8x8 foot, the decision for 3 8x8 foot elements?
I think it came down to that kind of that vertical panel that we were talking about, that example where we had 3 of those in a row. An 8-foot panel is kind of 6 to 8 feet, is kind of a common size that you could get. So we wanted to, it just seemed like it fit. It could be any number, but it's better if it fits some kind of standard size you get at Lowe's. It stinks when you can buy stuff at Lowe's that is illegal to actually put on your property, but we can't control what gets produced. So yeah, that number could be different. We just thought that was probably the most that we were comfortable with. Again, trying to provide a fair amount of latitude to people. People use their yards a lot of different ways, and not really trying to be overly restrictive at the same time.
Is there any concern about with that, the different sizes of yards, I guess, and the straight 3 8x8 for kind of as a one size fits all for all size yards?
That wasn't a concern that we had. My concern was saying that your whole property was limited to 3, just thinking the rear yard's
Right.
unrelated to your front yard. But no, we didn't get into if you have 150 feet of frontage, could you have more than 3? No, we didn't get into that. If that's a concern or an issue, then you could make that recommendation. But we, for the most part, not obviously here's a property that's not like everybody else. It's an older subdivision, older home that was built, current subdivisions, they're pretty much all the same in terms of lot size and yard spaces. So it seemed like a pretty uniform rule could be applied across the city. And then for me, having the same rule so that if you see 3 on one lot, that's what you can do. One issue we have is when someone does something that isn't permitted, someone else sees it, they do it, and then we got an issue of continuing it. So then if someone does 5 and they think they can do 5 and go, no, you can only do 3, for me, it's just better to have a uniform rule on something like this where it's really an exception, not the standard.
That would be,
Yep.
If they're hooked together.
That would be more than 8 feet
fence,
long.
That'd
Yep.
be a fence.
And it'd exceed 8 feet. So you couldn't take advantage of that exception. And then it would be a fence for sure.
And that's a side yard there.
It's a street side yard. Yeah.
And that would be, yeah, it would be permitted then. If it was joined together, if they put made it a continuous fence.
It would have to be, I didn't measure this, but I'm guessing it's slightly inside of the allowable setback of a fence. It's pretty close. Maybe it is compliant. The exception would allow this to exist. If you had to use current fence rules, it may or may not be right on the setback requirement.
Okay.
I wasn't trying to judge if this was placed
No.
correctly. It was just a great example of an easy example of what I've seen other people do in different circumstances.
So is there any actual concerns with the staff on what we're trying to change? I mean, we're not going to make another problem, Mark.
Well, my concern is we can't effectively administer the language we wrote 2 years ago.
Right.
So I want clear and understandable language. We tried to grant flexibility, clearly didn't work right because it's too open to interpretation. So my concern is just the language is clear. It's a black and white standard, one way or the other.
That's what I like, but
Yep. That's
it's easier to understand that way.
yep. That's what we're caring about. We're not arguing that
And
two is the right number or 6 is the right number. We're just saying we need a clear objective standard. And council's goal was to provide some flexibility. So that's where we're trying to not be overly restrictive and have some black and white standards for this exception.
So you don't see any of this opening it up to any further ambiguity.
I don't think so. I think it's pretty easy to measure 8 by 8. I'm not concerned about that. Now that we have a numerical standard, I think we can effectively administer that.
It's just not really changing anything, just laying out the pure guidelines. Or you're going to say, yeah, it's
I guess I don't think it's fundamentally different than the old language. I think you could, on the margins of that, you could say it's more restrictive or more permissive because there was not a limit of 3 landscape accents before. It just couldn't have the effect of being a fence.
That's right.
So now we're being clear, it's 3. So is that more restrictive? Possibly.
Okay.
But planner, and you'll see flag poles. We adjusted poles and stuff too, because again, what people think of these features is we have had people attach poles to fences and claim they're a landscape accent, but it's 14 feet high. No, it's attached to a fence as part of a fence. Like there's just a lot of different things that happen out there. So this covers, if you want to put 3 poles in your yard that are 14 feet tall, then you can now do that. You just can't attach it to your fence. And wanted to, we think we've covered the range of normal, the typical that we see. There's always going to be someone that has a new idea that's never been covered and maybe shouldn't be allowed. But this seems to capture the typical that we've seen. And then the other stuff, like if you look in the attachment where the language is, there's the new language for the accent. We're altering the mailbox, little library cluster unit boxes, flag poles, and lamp poles. So lamp poles are really there to cover commercial parking lots, not to have as many lights as you want all over your yard. So that's why I'm pulling them out separately and saying now outdoor lighting when it's related to driveways, sidewalks, and parking lots. So you can't just go and line your rear yard with lamp poles now, because that was not what was intended, but that theoretically could happen. And you get people again that put poles up and string lights or put up floodlights or whatever. Now those allowances are more restrictive here too, because we're pulling lights out, because it was originally about parking lots. It wasn't about lighting your whole backyard. Or if you think about the old days where you had the one lantern like up in your front yard, like kind of to illuminate the walkway up to your front yard. I know that's why that was written.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was written for, versus now people have a lot more different approach to lighting patios or other space in their backyard or maybe even the front yard.
But it all comes down to the setbacks. Is what
Yeah, this is all about
not
whether
addressing what you can actually put in your yard, just within the setbacks.
I think it's doing both. It's saying this is an exception within a setback for this type of thing. So they're related. And then we also are capping flagpoles, because I don't want to argue with somebody if you put 15 poles around your backyard, are they flagpoles or not? So again, I'm trying to clean up the
Right.
things that we can argue about to get into a more, yep, you get 3 flagpoles. I don't care what flags on them. I don't care what you do with them, but you don't get 15 flagpoles. That's not what we were trying to accomplish. So. And if you're outside your setback, you can have as many flagpoles as you want. So again, like you said, this is about whether you're in
There,
the 25.
that's what I was asking.
Yep. So if you're outside the setbacks, you're going to have as many flagpoles as you want. But you're going to be 20 feet from your rear property line. You're going to be 25 feet from your front property line.
Okay, that.
That's what I think you're going for.
Yes,
Yep.
that's what I was going for. The structures really aren't defined if after they're away from the setback.
Right. Once you're outside the setback,
Okay.
we don't really care what it is. It just because it meets setbacks.
In fact, I like this one for a change.
Does anyone have any other questions for staff? Okay. So the city is the applicant, so I guess we'll open it for public comment. Seeing none, close that. Does anyone have any additional questions for staff or any comments? Discussion?
Just that I actually like the boundaries.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. I think it's, having discrete requirements and clarity is important. And I think that my understanding of this reading this, it improves that. So I think that's good. All right. If there's no other questions or comments, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion for alternative number 1, recommend that city council approve the modified text for section 29.402, subpart 2, subpart C, subpart 8, which limits the number of landscape assets that exceed fence heights to 3 structures that are no greater than in any dimension other than 8 by 8 feet.
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion passes.
All right. All right. So our next item is really for discussion purposes to help give you guys some background on what's going on with City Council in terms of some of the Plan 2040 implementation. What you received in your packet is a slightly condensed version of what Council held a workshop in March about, and that was a 2.5-hour workshop, so I'm not intending to do that with you guys. So I'm going to go through some of these slides super quick because we're not making decisions or anything, but absolutely any questions you want to ask, we want to answer those tonight to help you understand what's happening. So again, we did a long presentation with Council. One of their priorities for Plan 2040 was to look at housing options across the city. And one of those things was specifically looked at infill options related to adding second units to a property. So in this workshop, we talked about infill at a broad level, kind of where are bigger areas we could see a significant amount of redevelopment or intensification. And then how do you possibly allow across the city very small increases in density with a second unit being added to an existing property. So that was really, that's why it was a long conversation, because you're talking about a really broad issue of infill. And one of the key parts of Plan 2040 related to infill is we're trying to get away from density being the measuring stick of success. So our old plan was really focused on density as how we're going to measure whether it's a good project or not. And we're all for minimum density. We think that's an efficient use of land. It helps the city provide services effectively and in a cost-efficient manner. So we're very supportive of minimum density. And at times, maximum densities make sense too, just to set boundaries. But just to say something meets a certain density range and declare it compatible with its surroundings, that is not what Plan 2040 is about. It's trying to find ways to add density, but in a contextual manner. So that meant the workshop, which is kind of the heart of this workshop, was to talk about, well, what are we expecting then from context? What do we think design elements are that we should apply to whatever we decide to allow in the city? So this was a very broad conversation to really talk about how infill can work in a way that still is supportive of that character of a neighborhood around it. So again, I'm not going to talk about every slide, so I'm going to kind of just go through these as we talk. So the two second unit things we talked about were duplexes, which are really two fully functional dwelling units on the same property that are attached. And an accessory living unit or an accessory dwelling unit we defined as a secondary unit. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but after the workshop and after a follow-up meeting with council, we've landed on it will be a newly constructed unit, meaning you can't convert a house into this. You'd have to build something new. And it's going to have some kind of size limitation to it to make it clearly secondary to the primary home. Versus a duplex won't have a size limit. Like you can have two 1,300 square foot dwelling units in a duplex, but an accessory dwelling unit's going to have a 900 square foot limit, which is our accessory building limit. At least that's how we're going to draft it at this point. So we're talking about two different ways to use a lot to get second units. And again, there's going to be certain areas where we're going to want to see total redevelopment, not just add a unit here or there. So we have some defined areas in the city broadly for infill. This map was kind of like, where are there areas for infill or growth that had not been planned for expansion? So there's a few of these areas around town. We have areas described as redirection areas, meaning until the city studies those, we aren't necessarily committed to redevelopment there, but they're areas that may be worth city effort to plan for and study and support infill. But until that's done, they're not designated for intensification. So those are a number of areas across town. We have a corridor area along Lincoln Way we'd like to see, both down by downtown as other parts of the Lincoln Way corridor also are meant for intensification as well. So the city did have a history with duplexes back in the 80s and 90s. The city slowly limited these options for the second units, and we had a history of conversions of homes that weren't successful either, that we weeded out through the process in the 80s too. So we do have an experience where this doesn't always work. So I think we're all trying to be cognizant of what were the issues that happened before, make sure we're not repeating those. Yeah, so that's something that we talked through with the city council as well, and I think that led a lot to, again, the issue that new construction is going to be the answer versus conversions of existing structures. That's how we're really going to focus on this. So we did have quite a bit of examples. We have a lot of history of duplexes in the city. Some of them, like the bottom right, you wouldn't even know that's two units when you drive by, just because of how the doors are positioned. It has a single garage. It's a very great example of something that I would say is contextual to the area, because it really might very little of it functions differently than a single family home. And then you have some other duplexes in other parts of town where the parking's not up front, but there's a row of duplexes. Again, scale's the same as any single family home on that block. It has two doors facing the street, but the rest of that structure really looks like everything else in that area. And then you see two modern versions of a duplex. Here's one where the garage is split, and you really see a lot of garage, but they're split apart. So it's two units. Roof lines and things are like the houses in that neighborhood, but it is a different feel with the way the garages are done in this area. And then you get to what I think is a really good example. So technically, This is a single family attached unit. So there is a lot line that goes through that little gravel strip, but for all intensive purposes, it works as a duplex. So if you have no development standards for a duplex, what you see in that tan model is the easiest way for a developer to build 2 units on the property. In most neighborhoods, I would say that is not a contextually designed structure. So you have a house next door where there's a garage on the far side, but you see the elements of what you would call outdoor living space or the entrance to the structure that define the structure. Here, when you're straight on, you don't even know where the doors are. They're tucked here behind on the corners. So even though they have a little covered entry, they're about 40 feet or 30 plus feet back on the structure. So I think for staff, when we get to allowing for these things, we're concerned that the guidelines are going to be able to manage this. We don't think that we should be allowing for this to just exist everywhere in the city, because it will not fit in most older neighborhoods. It just won't be the same. So this slide's a really good sample of what's around and how we think we need to be able to design regulations that support some of these other choices besides the 4 garage doors facing the street. Here's some other examples of other duplexes across town. Again, this top one isn't even a duplex. It's more like a 3 or 4 units. It just doesn't have a lot of parking. So it has like this dead end driveway. And then on the other side, it has another small driveway, but it doesn't have garages for everybody. So it's another example where if you don't have so much parking, you can get smaller units and smaller structures in. But as soon as you start to have to add covered parking for everything, those types of structures get harder to do. And here's another example. This was a conversation point. This lot here between these 2 structures used to have a duplex that looked just like this brown one that was demolished. So would we want to have this kind of a duplex from the 70s again exist here? We'll have to see how the design guidelines work out. But that was the question. Like, here's a vacant lot. What's going to be contextual? This, 1990s ranch style house, or is it going to be contextual to a 1970s duplex that probably isn't the taste of anyone any longer? So those are the kinds of context questions that we're going to have to think about when actual guidelines are written or actual standards, and which way that's going to go to help shape how these houses work. Again, here's another one that was really, this is a good example too. This is on South Duff. So we have one part of town. It's a little bit broader than the historic district. It's called the Single Family Conservation District. It has design requirements that say you can't have 2 doors facing the street. It requires a covered porch with the house. I mean, if you're in Old Town, you understand why those kinds of things are there. And this is, I think this is a pretty successful example, again, of someone following those single family design requirements, yet it's a duplex. The second entrance is way back on the side down that driveway. So from the front, it just looks like a standard, maybe a little bit wider proportion than a standard single family home with a Craftsman elements on it, but really that's what it looks like. And then you get other examples again where there's no design requirements and you don't know what you're going to get. So there's a few features here that you might say are an attempt to address that, but overall the massing's pretty vanilla. The driveway parking right in the front isn't really how most properties are done. So again, would that be acceptable or not? Those are the kinds of issues ultimately you're going to have to decide upon when standards are drafted. I'm going to just kind of keep going through this. So then beyond the duplex question, you start to talk about broader infill projects. So this is a common diagram you get in planning discussions, trying to explain the evolution of structures from lower density to higher density. And if you are a planning nerd and you pay attention to housing policy, you might hear the term missing middle. That's that beige area in the middle where people advance the idea that we used to build housing a lot differently than we do now. We seem to only build detached single structures or really large apartment buildings. And what happened to everything in the middle? So this is not necessarily a missing middle program. We're not necessarily targeting any one type of housing structure here, but we want to be able to accommodate some of those things. So some of the things we talk about are maybe smaller apartment buildings, the duplex, the triplex, the bungalow court, which is a cluster of houses around one open space. So this is a good diagram just to give you a sense of different housing types that you might hear about in different kinds of conversations. And it also helps us to talk about, when we're talking about infill and contextual, where on this continuum are we really targeting? We are not targeting mid-rise buildings unless it's one of those defined redirection areas where we are all in on redevelopment. And that's our goal, is to max out that resource, versus at the other end where we're just trying to add a unit here or there and hopefully not alter the existing conditions in any significant way. Infill housing, again, lots of different guidelines across the country, lots of different samples of what a contextual structure can be. You can define it by height, you can define it by roof form, you can define it by entry features. There's just a lot of different ways to do it, and it has been done successfully in other places. So we're pretty confident we can do it here when we get into the design standards. So a lot of these examples were just to, again, show different prototypes, different structures, give you a sense of what are some of the things that we think standards will have to address, whether it's the rhythm of the building patterns, how do setbacks work, entry features, roof lines. A lot of those things are what you're going to hear commonly are things that need to be dealt with. Now, you can write those things, and if a developer doesn't take them seriously, you cannot guarantee a nice structure. I can't promise you everything will look nice. I can promise you everything will have the feature that we told it to have, but that doesn't necessarily mean they put the pieces together in a complete way to make it look like a home versus just a structure that has things tacked onto it. So we hope for the best. We're going to be able to mitigate the worst, but we're going to hope for the best with the standards that we write. So then within ADUs, this presentation, before we had gotten direction, had a lot more conversation about different versions of it. So in April, what council really decided was that it's going to have to be it's going to have to be new construction. You may be able to convert an existing detached structure on your property, but you can't convert part of your home into a second unit. There are some building code and rental code issues about dividing up a house. Those were those conversion issues in the 80s that we didn't have a good experience with. It would just be better. We decided just be better to start off with allowing for new construction. You can manage that better. It's a little tidier in how it gets done. Bootleg units are less obvious. It seems like it'll work better for us as a starting point since we're not allowing them now. But this was an example of a lot of different ways to either add a unit or to convert a unit. Anywhere from adding a basement to adding a second floor to putting it in the attic. Again, detached structures. I'm not going to go back through the duplexes. So one type of unit, which we even use the phrase tonight, townhomes. So townhomes don't exist in our vocabulary in our zoning ordinance. People use it all the time. It has different meanings within how it looks to people. It also has a different meaning in how the building code treats it versus an apartment building. So one thing that we do want to deal with is we think that a townhome is generally a structure that's compatible with a lot of different densities. It can be a little bit lower density and it can be higher density. It's easy to put different roof forms on it. It's easy to address access to it and entry features. So we think it's one of those missing middle structures that can be successful in a lot of different places. So one of council's directions out of this workshop was to come back with a building type that will be defined as a townhome. And the key component to that will be that it will not require parking on a per bedroom basis. So everything you see here could be built now. It's just that it would be treated as an apartment and it would have to have a parking space per bedroom. So once you have to have 3 parking spaces for a 3-bedroom townhome, you don't build that. You build an apartment building with 4-bedroom units because it's more efficient to lay out a parking lot. So we're trying to incent a building type that we think is a better fit versus defaulting to how the parking formula is going to get you to an apartment building. You can still build the apartment building. We're not trying to take that away from you necessarily, but we're trying to incent a different type of housing unit here. So when we write that standard, it's going to be looking at that 2 spaces per unit, which is how we treat single family detached or ownership housing. And we're not going to worry so much about a 3-bedroom unit having that 3rd parking space. And this will be a useful tool, we believe, in those infill areas that we have kind of designated or planned maybe to the west of campus. So in the Campus Avenue area, the West Street area, there's some older areas that have sort of evolved, but not necessarily. We actually have restrictions that kind of limit their evolution right now. we think the townhome style unit could be very helpful in getting 4 or maybe 6 units on that lot with some garage parking below and maybe units above, or having rear loaded units like that middle diagram where the parking's to the back. So that's what we hope. Now, the example on the right is what we want to avoid. So a lot of planners and a lot of architects have pursued the townhome model of housing. It can be very efficient if you don't care about how it looks or relates to the street. So the one on the right is not what we want to see. Denver's spent a lot of time they wanted to do infill and intensify, and they wrote a lot of new zones that allowed for townhomes, but then they started to get this because it was the most efficient thing to do. And now they've undone that and put really restrictive requirements on how the end units work. So you can still do the row of units, but there's some more expectations about how the end units work. So I would say from my experience with townhomes, it's always a struggle to get the developer to deal with the end unit because they just want to do the pattern of what they're building all along that row, and they don't really want to customize the end unit. So again, we're going to have to decide as a community, is that efficiency of the density of the priority, or are we going to say, no, we expect the end unit to be a little bit different and have more of a curb appeal to it. So the far right is what we don't want. We want to see something that's a little better than that in terms of relating to the street. You guys might remember this. You were here, some of you were here for the land use change, but then you definitely were here for, some of you were here for the zoning change. So this is a 6-unit project on Delaware. It's under construction right now. It'll be interesting. This should be done here later this summer. So it'll be, it was a good first step. We don't have a lot of lots like this as a vacant lot in a developed area. We don't have a lot of those. So it's a good sample of one way to do this. I think the architecture is fine. I think our issue was the way the units are oriented. It doesn't have a lot of relationship to the street. So when it's done, we'll have to go out and kind of understand what was that a negative trade-off to do this slanted orientation versus trying to pull a unit out to the street or not. We'll have to go just all look at that and make some of our own judgments about the effectiveness of this. But there are some benefits. The way it got angled kind of pulled that side wall effect on the side properties in. You just didn't have a uniform wall right up against there. So that's probably a positive. But I think overall it's going to be a pretty good fit for the area, but it's a great example for us to all go see this summer when it's done. So the cottage neighborhood or the pocket neighborhood is that bungalow court example in the missing middle. What the intent here is to really focus smaller units. They don't have to be small, but generally they are smaller units around a common area. So you basically build all of your structures on one side, have kind of a green space that they're oriented around, and then put the parking to the other side. So again, you're not beholden to every unit having a garage that's with the structure, because every time you do that, it's going to dictate site layout and access. It just gets really, you get the same thing because there's a way to do it. If you can free up where the parking is, you can get more creative design. So council also asked us to create in the zoning ordinance a way to do this. Right now it would be precluded from being done. We don't allow multiple individual homes on a lot. They would have to be apartments to do that. And then our PUD ordinance doesn't kick in. So the flexibility of a PUD doesn't kick in unless you have 2 acres. Neither of these 2 examples are 2-acre sites. So if you had a bigger site, yes, you could do it. But if you only have a small site, you couldn't do this cluster kind of housing. So council asked us to come back with this too. I don't know that we'll see a lot of these, but I think it would be really successful if somebody could do this. I think a lot of people in Ames, or a fair number of people, would probably be interested in having an individual unit around green space and not too worried about where their car's parked. So I think it could be successful, and we'll be proposing that as well in response to council's motion.
Like what I was talking several times, almost like a tiny home.
Yeah, I think
I think that would be a good infill.
Yeah, so these are pretty small in this
Right.
picture. I'm not trying to say you have to build a 500 square foot home to be a cottage home. I think in this example, you can see how they can get really tight and small, interesting houses, but there's different ways to do that. But yeah.
But it'd be a great starter home for a lot of people.
Yeah. It's just another way to have kind of that permanent roof over your head that's individual space, but it's not an overwhelming size. It's not probably at a high, well, I'm never going to say it's not at a high price point where it aims. So who knows what it would really cost. So infill, again, we talked about this, context matters. We eventually need standards that we can agree will generally fit the area. And that's going to depend on a lot of different features. So as we walked through the concept of what's contextual design, we focused on that list on the right are the things that are going to affect it the most. Front setback, we have some pretty uniform setbacks in the city, so that might not be the biggest issue. Some other towns might have had a history of having like 60-foot front setbacks, or just a lot of older, larger lots where units aren't up to the street. That's not really Ames. There's a few of those, but that's not our history. So setbacks are probably not going to be the biggest issue. That orientation is going to be that, again, do you have a front door that faces the street? Do you just have garage doors that face the street? What exactly are we looking for here in terms of the presentation back to the public space? How do the massing of the units work? How do the roof heights work? One thing that's always an issue when you get into infill is the way you build a house now is not the way a house was built in the 60s, 70s, or even the 80s. So foundation height, floor to ceiling heights, roof pitch, all of those things are greater now than they used to be. So you might say, I'm just building a 2-story house, but that 2-story house could easily be 4 to 6 feet taller than the 2-story house that's next to it. So, we're not going to get people to go back to 7-foot ceilings or anything that's not desirable, but it's one of those things with height where having a story limit, I like that. It's flexible, but it isn't necessarily going to be the same story height as the ones around it. So it's just something to be cognizant of. It's a real complaint. I mean, if you're living in a lower height 1-story home and someone comes in with a 2-story home that's really 33 feet tall and you're in a 14-foot tall ranch, that's quite a bit different. So even though on the paper, we'd all say a 1- and 2-story home are used to being next to each other, right? I mean, that's in every neighborhood in the city. It's just whether that new house is a lot different than that old house. So we had a lot of different diagrams in here, again, trying to deal with the question of patterns, orientation, garage orientation, parking. Those are all things that come into play. Honestly, parking is going to be the biggest one. If you have space to put parking in the side or the rear, it still costs more to do that. You have to build a longer driveway. You have to use up rear yard space to do it. So developers are generally loath to do that. So if that's going to be our expectation, it's going to have to be very clear. Like, we'll allow the units, but you're going to have to do it in a way that might not be the cheapest way to do it. You're going to have to, if you can, you're going to have to put it in the rear yard or side yard or off an alley. So again, a lot of different examples, height, different types of units, different ways to do things. Roof types, unfortunately, the city's tried to do this in a couple of different situations across the city, try to use certain design specifications, and they're not always successful. So there's an area called the South Lincoln Mixed Use District, which is really 3rd Street to 2nd Street. So 2nd Street to 4th Street between Sherman and Walnut. So like where Ken's Appliances, that area, Celebrations. So in that area, we've had a few redevelopment projects in the last 20 years. And one of the defining things there is it's supposed to be smaller apartment buildings. I think 16 units is the max in any one building. But there's a lot of older kind of bungalow style single family homes before redevelopment ever happened. So we have a roof pitch requirement in the code. Well, that seems like a great idea because you have bungalows with steep pitched roofs. Well, the proportions of a new home or a new structure are not that of a bungalow. So now you've made them extra tall because you've required a 612 pitch on the roof, and it's a wider home, and you've maybe made it less compatible by using a roof pitch requirement that mimicked a smaller structure. So I'm not against roof lines. I think that's something we're going to have to control, but we just can't blindly say you got to match a roof pitch to the surroundings, because bigger structures, they just aren't the same if you have those steeper roofs. So I think we've learned that lesson down there. The roof pitch requirements, I think, work in the single family conservation overlay and the historic district areas. I think those work. The one in the South Lincoln, I don't believe has worked really well just because the mass of the structure is not controlled. It's just the roof height or the roof pitch, and that doesn't work on its own. Like we said, parking, I think in our experience, the side loaded parking is going to be a better solution. This like courtyard housing option down here in the middle where you have 2 units facing the street and then 2 units behind, but the parking is kind of accessed not directly off the street. It's pretty successful. I think it'll be interesting if you do allow, let's say in this example, a 1-car garage to face the street. Will the market build that? So we only require 2 parking spaces for a duplex. So if this top right duplex was built in the city, a 1-car garage with a space in the driveway meets code. So it'd be interesting if we ended up writing our duplex standards to only allow a 1-car garage to face the street. Would people build something like this? And in this case, it's a modern take on design, but it has a lot of features that I think people would say are pretty successful in terms of the quality of the building and the appearance of the building. So again, parking is going to be a real critical piece to how we allow for that. Examples of rear parking and different types of units here. A couple of different, again, options where rear parking is, here's the trade. This is a great example of the trade-off, right? So 3 garage cuts off the street, way cheaper for the developer, right? Than building this driveway and coming to the back. Now, the other trade-off of doing all of this is you've eaten up the rear yard space. So there is a trade-off to the rear access if it's not off an alley, and we don't have a ton of alleys in the city. There's parts of town that do, but not a lot of them. So that will be one of those questions for a trade-off. On the detached garage, on the single lots, you still do get some yard area. So that's going to be that balance of what we're looking for as a city. So we had a couple, again, this exercise of what's compatible, what's not. There's covered entries. You see covered entries here on these other 2 houses, but is this covered entry anything like these covered entries? I don't think any of us would say that's the same thing. So that's where I'm saying we can write the words, but if the developer doesn't take it seriously in the terms of how they want to integrate those features into the project, you're still not going to get what you see on that street. And there's no way that zoning can really actively force good design. We can require you to do things, but it's nearly impossible for zoning to actively say that this is a great building or not. So we'll just have to be aware of that, make sure we have good starting points for the standards and hope that they work successfully as they get implemented. Again, just different examples of different things. This is, I think, in our opinion, maybe you don't agree, these were why or why not questions. Is this approach to a covered porch without garages a better example than that structure? So you can kind of flip back and forth, which one's better? Trying to ignore that there's a 3rd story on this one. Another example, right? So here you have a 3-story, someone did an addition to their house, got to that 3rd story, lots of step backs, lots of changes in roof elements. Here's a version where it's a thinner house, higher pitched roof, that's that 3-story versus 2 stories. Is that compatible? Different roof pitches, different types of alignments of houses here. And we're not going to say this. One point of this slide was that contemporary design is not permitted. So again, we're not in an historic district. So if someone wants to do a shed roof, our design guidelines are unlikely to say a shed roof is not allowed. It's going to be more about that height and having some of these other elements that relate back to the street is what we're going for. In a historic district, you would say no to that just because it wouldn't be, assuming it's not a modern home subdivision, you would be saying no to that. But I don't think citywide we're saying no to modern architecture. Again, duplexes exercise on what's compatible, what's not. So I think what City Council has landed on, and we attached these maps to the report. Actually, we don't have them in here. City Council was, the first question was, if we're going to allow second units, where do you allow them? So in the city, our land use map of Plan 2040 uses an RN designation, so residential neighborhood 1, 2, and 3. 1 you can think of as more those alley focused older subdivisions of the city. So Old Town, a couple other places have alleys. RN2 is more that post World War II era. So about 40 to 50 years of maybe a little bit of alley, but generally smaller lots, typically a ranch house or a front loaded home, but an older established neighborhood. And then RN3 is really the areas since 2000 that have been built in the city. I'm sure you've all seen, it's FSRL. It's the standard areas that you see across the city. So where are we going to allow these? What are the different characters in these areas? And so City Council did ask for information to understand where covenants would restrict these. Are we going to overly concentrate options for second homes across the city? Are they really buildable from a lot coverage perspective? We talked a lot about, do different standards in your zoning ordinance indirectly preclude you from building something that you said was okay to build? So one of the things we use as a proxy for that is lot coverage. So if you get to 60% lot coverage, that's the most you can have on a lot. So if we were going to allow detached structures, we didn't want to say they're fine and then find out everybody already has 60% lot coverage, so you can't do it. So we did that exercise in a GIS analysis, and we found out that really wasn't a barrier. Very few people are really at that standard. But we did find out roughly just over 20% of, how did the covenant statistic work? Do
It's
you
about
remember?
24%.
Of single family homes.
Mhm.
So what we did map, and it's in your packet, was covenants, and developers can put whatever restrictions they want on their subdivisions. And since the 90s, it's been very common to write in a couple of different ways, limiting factors for second units. You can't divide your lot, you can't convert your basement, and you can't add a second structure on your property. Those three things are very commonly written into covenants. So Eloise did a lot of research. We were able to map most of the existing, or if not all of the existing covenants in the city, and it impacts over 20% of our single family homes in the city. So even though we're talking about allowing them citywide, those covenants would restrict them from happening. So you just think about basically any subdivision since 1990 probably restricts it. Some people have let their covenants lapse, and more might let them lapse as they go forward. Every 21 years, you have to renew them or they expire. So that's a factor. And then the other thing that was an issue was, again, we had some concerns a few years back about overly concentrating single family rentals. It's really a south of campus issue, a west of campus, and then a little bit to the east of campus issue. The majority of the city does not have a single family rental concentration issue, but you can understand why near campus that's a question. So another issue for them was, if we were to allow second units, are we undermining our goal of not over intensification of rentals in those areas? So we have an area called a near campus overlay that's in the land use plan of our comp plan, as well as in the rental code. And we talked about how the rental code is written. You can't add a bedroom count to a property after 2018 that was not already there. So if you have a 4-bedroom house in that area, you can have your occupancy based on those 4 bedrooms as a rental property. But you can't take a 2-bedroom house, do a 3-bedroom addition, and make your house into a 5-bedroom unit for occupancy purposes. So there's a limit that we won't let you basically add on bedrooms to increase the amount of rental occupancy in that area. So if we allow second units like an ADU in near campus areas, we can do that, and then it can be controlled from the rental code perspective. So I think the way that was described is that if we move forward with those ADUs, zoning may allow those things to exist, but the rental code wouldn't necessarily allow for them to increase rental occupancy on a property. So it might be a good match for trying to allow for someone that's a homeowner that wants to, have a second unit on their property, maybe have a large pool house or have just a guest house for someone. They can still do that because they don't intend to rent it. But then if someone was a rental investment property, they wouldn't be able to really get any return out of doing it. So it might manage itself that way. So ultimately, with that information, council said to pursue allowing ADUs citywide, all zones or all single family areas of the city, to allow duplex also. So we are tasked next with drafting those standards. And as I said, we will have to have some design requirements that go with that. So our next step is to take some of that basic framework that council agreed to in April, create effectively zoning standards for them for each type of structure, have council agree that's what they were intending for us to do, and then they will decide what the outreach strategy is in terms of how much neighborhood outreach there is, what's the community awareness for something like this. And then we would move forward with that. And then you guys would be involved in reviewing. We'll give you updates on the draft strategies or the draft standards, but then ultimately all this has to come back through the planning commission. You'll be the first round of hearings. So if the public is, loves it, hates it, who knows, you guys are going to be the first audience to take on comment of whatever those final regulations are when we go through hearings to amend the zoning ordinance. So that's why I wanted to make sure I got you an update now. It might become a topic of conversation throughout the summer at the earliest. If we can get back to council in June, which is my goal with some draft standards for these things, I would say it's hard to believe it would be back for final adoption until September. So that would be my rough guess now, is hopefully keep the ball moving in June, have opportunities for a couple of months of community input, and then have the ability to adopt an ordinance early fall. That's kind of the timeline we're working on right now. And then we have those other follow-up issues. The townhome thing we'll do separately. The cottage neighborhood will be due separately because they're really not tied to those other issues. And then the other thing that council wants, must have skipped that map. Do we still have the map that showed like the corridor area west of campus in here?
I don't think it was,
I think I cut that one, didn't I?
yeah.
So the other, I guess I only left this one in. So the other thing that council asked was for prioritization of areas for that more intensification of infill. So we will also come back to council and probably define areas where those, like once we agree on the townhome prototype or other things that might allow for infill, come back and look at broader areas for study. Again, there'll be some level of outreach related to those things. So what I was trying to get to was a map that really probably looks at this west of campus area. Again, Campus Avenue, Lincoln Way area, Wood Street, Hunt. Those are some of those areas where they're ripe for redevelopment. There's likely a strong market to support it. So we could make some dent in adding more housing in those areas and hopefully do it in a compatible way. So those are areas we'll probably be proposing back to council, and they'll have to say, yeah, we want you to prioritize that, go do neighborhood outreach, create whatever design requirements we're looking at. One of the key things in all of those areas is the last comp plan. Its policy was its version of controlling compatibility was through parking. And you've heard this a couple of times. Parking will dictate whether this works or not. So in those areas, the current policy is to require extra parking close to campus. So there's 25% more parking required next to campus than there is anywhere else in the city. And the reason for that was 20 years ago, the concern was over occupancy. There was just more people living in these units than they were meant for, which meant there was more cars. I'm not saying there's not over occupancy. That doesn't seem to be the crisis or the complaint that we're dealing with on a regular basis any longer. And it definitely inhibits producing units when you have to build 25% extra parking when you're in the closest walking distance to the main destination of the city. So that'll be something that when we come back, we're gonna have to ask seriously about. We have to look seriously about definitely not asking for extra parking, but are we gonna allow for maybe some version of a parking reduction, recognizing the walkability of the area. So that'll be a conversation depending on what areas we pick. But yeah, the extra 25% is a tough one to deal with. So that's kind of really quick run through of a lot of things that we talked to council about. All of them will come back to you at some point. And yeah, any questions for us? Eloise spent a lot of time on this, and I've been involved heavily as well. So we're here to answer questions.
I see a main problem, 900 square feet for a ADU?
So we started with that because in our current accessory building allowance is 900 feet. So you can build a 900-foot detached garage in your backyard now. So we started with 900 feet, matching what you can do for any other type of structure.
That's a max.
That's the max.
Okay, because that was bigger than my first time I had here.
It's not small. Yeah, I mean, you still have to meet setbacks. You still have to meet lot coverage, some other things, but 900 feet is doable.
But for an ADU, I think it's too big, really. Just my idea. And then the way you're talking, it has to be a standalone structure. And they can't put it on top of their garage. Is what you're looking at for the start with.
So I think that detail will get fleshed out when we come back. So the level of detail that we got to was it needed to be new construction, not conversion of existing space. And the follow-up question was, what if it's a detached structure? Can it be converted like a detached garage into a living unit? And we agreed that wasn't what we meant to restrict with the detached garage. Now, could you do an addition to your house and that meets the new construction requirement? We didn't cover that. So that'll be a detail that has to get resolved when we come back with the details.
I can see a lot of
So to
problems
me,
with the ADUs.
so my first thought is if you're attaching it to your house, it's going to be a lot more like a duplex than it is an ADU. So my first thought is it would fall under the duplex standards rather than the ADU standards. But that's a question to still be answered.
And if I remember right, reading in here, the state is getting involved with a little new regulations.
Right.
on it.
They have not. So we went a little slow here the last couple of months, and legislative session should be ending here. Fingers crossed, quickly.
Sooner than later.
There is a pending bill that I think it was 12 units or less. Basically, any structure that was 12 units or less, primary or accessory, it was going to say that a city cannot control the types of materials used on the roof or the siding, the type of windows, the types of doors, the garage doors, a bunch of things that all kind of relate to stuff that we don't tell people how to build their houses now. It's only in like this kind of situation that we're talking about being more detailed about this. So it would limit the ability of a city to directly manage any of those issues about really design of a structure. It still said you could control orientation and massing. So if it gets adopted, we'll have to navigate what that means and how much we can do. And if it's too, maybe it's too restrictive and we can't do what we want, and maybe we pull back from the second units. I hope not. I hope it hasn't passed. There's only a few days left. I'm not sure that it will pass at this point. It's kind of late in the session, but we'll know that before we get here in June. So the other one is, that's a pretty big one in terms of how a lot of cities kind of control second units.
Because you can't really plan for it if the state's getting their fingers into it.
If you're trying to say it's okay if it's compatible, but you can't control the compatibility measures, it's going to be tricky. And then the other one is the direction from council was to approach the ADUs as one of the two units on the property had to be owner occupied. So you could either be the owner and live in the front house, or you could be the owner and live in the small house. But that was the take on a way to start the program. We still have to talk to the city attorney and get into that a little bit more, because we have some state code that limits how you manage rental properties in terms of relationships, familial status, and caps on rental properties. So if that can be done or not, we don't know for sure, but the direction from council right now was to say only one or the other can be rented.
But with the properties that might be adding, they're not going to be able to cut out this ADU and sell it separately.
No, you wouldn't be able to do that,
Okay.
because then you'd have to meet, well, provided they can't create a legal lot with that structure on it. Right, you can't carve it
Okay.
off and sell it. Right, so we have a minimum lot size of typically 6,000 square feet in the city. You have to have certain amount of street frontage. So most people would not be able to carve up a lot and somehow make that second unit another unit, or it's a separate unit on a separate lot.
And then you'll also be looking at, okay, around the campus town area, right in that campus town area, you can't control a lot. But is this going to,
What do you mean by we can't control?
well,
the
you
lot?
can, with the zonings and everything you have a structure there. But if you get out just outside of it, then start building ADUs into these places, you're just going to expand the big rental area names.
Are you saying if the state law passes, or you're just saying regardless of the state law?
Regardless of its state law.
So the way I think it's going to work, provided that we can do what we think we can do, what I was talking about, that near campus overlay.
I'm talking about just outside that near campus overlay. So the way to avoid that near campus overlay is by going just outside of it.
Sure. So that's pretty, I mean, that gets further away from campus. That's why it's not
Right.
near. So, I mean, we're going to allow them citywide, right? So it can be in North Ames, it can be in South Ames, it can be in West or East Ames. That's the intent. It's only in that near campus overlay where it wouldn't allow you to, bump up your bedroom count to do it as more occupants in your rental permit. But if we're only going to allow an owner occupied property to have one, that's the other mitigating circumstance. Now, if we find out we can't control whether they're both rented or not, that'll be the council's choice. Then are they still going to want to do it? But right now it's going to be one rental, one property with one of two buildings being able to be rented. So that should, again,
Unless,
If you're
unless
really-
the
if
state
you're-
shuts that part down.
and it might not, again, I don't know if it's allowed or not for sure right now. So again, if you're really trying to support ADUs in the city, you would not have the owner occupied requirement. It will be an impediment. A lot of owner occupied people are not probably interested in becoming landlords and invest in that. Some will, but investment properties are way more likely to take advantage of it because that's their goal. So so if we really were going to push this program, we would drop the owner occupied requirement and let it just be, if you want to run it, you can run it or not. But that's not how that's not how it's intended to be drafted right now. Public input could change that.
What's the virtue, I guess, of having the owner occupied requirement? Or what's the thought behind that, I guess?
Yeah, I would say from Eloise's research, a lot of it is just the idea that if the landlord is on site, it mitigates unruly conduct of the rental. I guess that's where we're coming from, versus absentee landlord and more rentals and more people in one spot. So now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the approach. And it's a lot of cities have started with that from research to see if that works. Some of the things like Eloise communicated to council is Bloomington, Indiana. They started with an approach that required a special use permit and a bunch of other rules. Well, over 5 years, hardly any got built. So they pulled back all those rules because they really wanted to see more get built. So it took them a few years of seeing very little happen before they decided they wanted to see loosen it up. So, yep, no decisions tonight, just information, background for you all. So when you start to see new things come back as zoning ordinance amendments or other updates, you got a starting point for the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Kelly.
Okay.
Now moving on to the review of the bylaws or annual requirement.
So it's just your annual review, just a copy of the bylaws. If there's nothing that anybody wants to change, then no actions needed. If somebody wants to edit it, you would make a motion specifically about what you would like to be changed. We would write that up and bring it back to a future meeting for consideration.
And you can do that at any time. long as there's a majority vote.
I mean, can a bylaw be edited anytime in the year? Yes, it can.
Yes.
We just have a custom of bringing to you
Right.
the first meeting in May in case you wanted to look at something. It's always a two-step process. You consider it, propose it, adopt it.
I think last year you gave us the same
Yeah.
handout at one meeting, and then we came back with ideas at the next meeting, and then I think it was, and then the next month. That's kind of why we were clearing to July by the time we approved it. But
Yeah, you might not have had meetings every
yeah,
Every month.
yeah,
Either-
I'm sure there were some
Yeah.
meetings where
Yeah.
we skipped too, but
Called COVID, I think.
not last year.
last year was pretty good. And my first year on the commission, I didn't meet anybody until after I'd been on it for a year, So- which was strange.
When was the last, I think this was before I was on this, but when was the last review of the comprehensive plan?
We just adopted it 18 months ago.
Yeah. Okay.
Just
So yeah, so council's
Before-
actually,
yeah, before I was on it, yeah.
yeah, so it's only 18 months old. So council's actually on next Tuesday, we wrote into when we adopted that plan that within 18 months, council can adopt edits and clarifications. So we do have a package of things going next Tuesday to them, which are mostly like cleanup of maps and tables and some other things. But then, what we're talking about now instead of staff comments, but the fringe plan has now expired. So on May 1st, we no longer have an Ames urban fringe plan. So part of the amendments on Tuesday is to scrub language related to references to the fringe plan.
I was going to bring that up under commission comments. What's the status of that?
Yeah, so over the last 12 months, we had been working with Story County and Gilbert about creating an update. In September of last year, Story County had suggested some significant changes to the draft. Council responded and there was some back and forth, and we did not agree with their last set of changes back in the beginning of April. So the plan update is on hold, and the current agreement, which is called the 28E agreement, has now expired. So now we don't have, we all have our default state powers of subdivision review instead of a joint agreement that divvied up the administration of it. So it's not that it can't come back. It's just that there's the 28E is expired and we are not actively working on the update. We just weren't in the same spot as what the county was looking for at the end of the process at this point.
All right, any other comments or questions on the bylaws? Okay. Then go on to commission comments then. Anyone have any?
anything going on for
course.
next month, next meeting?
Yeah, I believe you're going to have a rezoning application on the east side of town. So I think I believe that'll be for sure on the agenda.
Must be Dayton Avenue.
It's on East 13th Street.
Oh, okay.
Just in comment that's kind of related to the infill design. Let's see, it's slide number 22. It's the one where we were talking about pocket or cottage neighborhoods with the common area in the middle. The last apartment I lived in, my wife and I lived in before we bought our first house in 1984. We were in Edgewood Park Apartments for 3 years, which was kind of loosely designed after the post-World War II garden apartments. And so you had an L-shaped fourplex where you have 3 two-story townhouse or row houses next to each other, and then the bottom of the L then was a ranch style. And then in our instance, there was an elderly couple that lived in there, and it was a ranch style, and it worked out great. You had that big central area, and I tell you, it was always full of kids. And I imagine they haven't done more of that because it probably isn't financially viable like it may have been back then. But that was really a nice setup. And I'm sure it still is.
There's still lots of kids there.
Yeah.
I live just down the street.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a unique multifamily property in
Yeah.
the city.
Yep.
You didn't really see it replicated on any scale like that. But yeah. I think, when we wrote FSRM and FSRL zoning, the basis of the 97 plan was trying to look at things that people liked in the city and say, why can't new development be that way? Well, they wrote rules and it still didn't turn out like that. Right?
Yeah.
So, so the smaller apartment buildings didn't turn into the larger green spaces and clustered around areas. They turned into what we see, which is, pretty efficient boxes and rectangles with parking and no green space. But yeah.
Any staff comments?
Staff comment?
We covered the fringe plan. Like I said, going to be some, again, no new policies are coming into the comp plan on Tuesday, but it is cleaning up references to different things. The fringe plan is gone. I'm not sure how I don't know if that's going to really affect the commission. So what that means from a subdivision, we still have our 2-mile extraterritorial jurisdiction around the city. We have authority over subdivision. We don't have authority over zone changes. We don't have authority over how the county permits development in the county. We only have control over whether it's divided or not, and principally whether it includes urban infrastructure, meaning paved streets, curbs, gutters, sanitary sewer, water services. Those are the types of things. So commonly what the request is for the city to waive our jurisdiction and then let the county approve it. Those types of waivers don't come to the commission. The only time you would see it if it was truly a preliminary plat. So I don't know that it really changes anything that you guys see, but council will definitely get more waiver requests because there's not a plan that's going to say this is allowed or not allowed any longer. But it's really the same in the sense that we didn't have a joint agreement with Boone County. We did with Story County. So it's really how we've been working in the Boone County environment for the last 20 years, looking at how our policies apply to those situations. So Plan 2040 still has policies about the fringe. We just don't have a fringe plan per se with a joint administration agreement. So it's not like it's all of a sudden going to be rural development all around the city.
Was there any thought or discussion about renewing the 2080 for a set amount of time, another 6 months or what?
So it had been extended 3 times already.
Oh, okay.
And so my opinion was that the 2080 locks in the 2006 plan.
No.
And, the further we get away, like the Plan 2040 is not that. Like we have a whole growth area in South Ames. It's not in the fringe plan. So we're limited by that. Are we not going to do our sanitary sewer project to expand into that growth area because we're living by an old fringe plan that says we're not going to grow there? Like it just starts to get muddy, and there was not a clear date of resolution. So council said, we don't want to accept these changes. That's not what we're going to do right now, and we don't want to use that 2080 anymore because it's just getting too far out of date. So it was supposed to have expired last July. Got extended a couple of different times, and the county had proposed extending it till June, and we just did not do that.
All right. Well, if there's no other comments,
No, and I think I'm pretty confident you'll have a meeting in 2 weeks,
okay.
like 95% sure.
All right. Okay. I guess with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
All in favor, say aye.
All right.
Aye.
All opposed? Adjourn.